get started, we're waiting for one more person, and she'll just join us. Alison Gaylin isn't here yet, so. Okay, we've decided to keep this Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock. We're going to keep it really casual, really interactive. I know you all have questions to ask, so we're going to have a lot of time for questions at the end. So we're deciding to go down the line, I think, and introduce ourselves because moderator Wendy had sort of shirked here on the duty. So I'm Wendy Corsi Staub. I'm an author with HarperCollins. I'm the author of The Good Sister. I don't have a copy with me. That's how organized I am. But I have some great T-shirts that I brought to bring home. So
T-shirt cannon?
T-shirt. So we're going to go right down the line in introduction. And Michelle, go right ahead.
I'm Michelle Gagnon. I'm the author of the Persephone trilogy. The first book was Don't Turn Around, and that kicks off with a 16-year-old girl who's a former foster kid who managed to sort of create a life for herself outside the system. And then one day she wakes up on an operating table with an incision in her chest and no memory of how she got there. And for the rest of the book, she's on the run. It's basically kind of Girl with a Dragon Tattoo meets The Bourne Identity with hacking and conspiracy theories and all sorts of other fun stuff.
Hi everybody, I'm Emmy Laybourne, and I have written the Monument 14 trilogy. Monument 14, oh my god, nicest thing ever. Monument 14 tells the story of 14 kids who get trapped in a superstore while civilization collapses outside the gates. And in book 2 of the series, which is Sky on Fire, some of the kids decide to try to make it to an evacuation site and others stay behind. And the reason why they stay behind is that the air outside the store, there's been a chemical weapons leak and the air turns part of the population into paranoid freaks and part become infertile and then some of the people turn into bloodthirsty monsters who tear everybody apart. So some of them go out, some of them stay in. And it's a very dark series, but there is some real light in the middle of it as these kids band together to try to save each other and save themselves.
I'm Alex London. This is my young adult debut, Proxy. Proxy takes place fittingly for right now in a world where there is no government. There is only the free market. And in this world, the rich can pay for the poor to take their punishments when they screw up or break the rules or get in trouble. And the story is about a privileged kid named Knox who has every 16 years old. He has everything you could ever want. He's rich, he's powerful, he's dashingly handsome and God's gift to women, and he gets in trouble all the time. But he has a proxy who takes his punishments. This orphan, Sid, who lives in the slums and just gets hard labor and tortured on Knox's behalf his whole life until Knox steals a car and kills a girl. And the punishment is too much for Sid to bear, and Sid breaks his contract and goes on the run and gets caught up with Knox in a conspiracy that's much bigger than the two of them, and they're going to need each other to survive, if they can survive each other first. That's Proxy.
I gotta say, this is the second time I've sat next to Alex this month and heard him describe his book, and it sounds better each time.
I'm Robin Wasserman. I'm the author of the Cold Awakening trilogy, The Book of Blood and Shadow, and this new book, The Waking Dark. And The Waking Dark is about a small town in Kansas where one day several people who seem perfectly normal snap for no reason and basically kill everyone in sight, and then themselves. And that is bad, and then things get worse. Yeah, well, sure. A tornado hits the town, there's disaster, the town gets quarantined, everyone is trapped inside this town, and everyone, for reasons that are not immediately known, starts to go slowly insane and giving into all of their darkest and most horrific desires. Except for our 5 main characters, who seem to be the only people who keep their wits about them and have to get out of the town and find a way to survive before the town completely loses its mind and everything goes to hell. So that's the book, yes.
Hi, I'm Nicholas Mennuti. I'm the co-author of Weaponized, and our book sounds rather quotidian now after those other. Basically, Weaponized is it's a thriller. It's about a computer programmer who who's responsible for working with the NSA and is hiding out in Cambodia and gets involved in an identity switch with another American who's also in Cambodia, and mischief ensues.
Hi, my name is David Guggenheim. I wrote the book with Nick Mennuti. This is my first time at a panel, so this is pretty cool. And like Nick said, the book is a thriller, sort of a cross between Bourne and North by Northwest, mistaken identity adventure, set in a very kind of scary, real, grounded Cambodian thriller backdrop.
Hi, I'm Alison Gaylin. You can just imagine my book here. So state of the art, it's actually invisible. It's called Into the Dark, and it's the second book in the Brenna Spector series for HarperCollins, same publisher as Wendy. My books focus on a private investigator with hyperthymistic syndrome, which is perfect autobiographical memory, the worst thing I could ever imagine experiencing myself. So I decided to write a character who has it. It serves her very well in her career as a private investigator, but it's torture as far as her personal life goes. And the next book, tentatively titled Stay With Me, is going to be out next July, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about thrillers, because we're talking about the modern thriller and keeping people turning pages, and not everybody knows that thriller is very specifically defined within genres. So you guys, we're not going to go up and down the line, like we're just going to speak out when you have something to say. Let's talk about the elements that you think are necessary for a thriller and what sets it apart from other genres, like a mystery or...
It feels like a pop quiz.
Yes, I'm feeling like my teacher is getting my teacher on.
Right answer. You're being graded. You are being graded. I think the most important thing is there has to be some sort of ticking clock.
Yeah.
For me, a thriller shouldn't, at the most it takes place over the course of 2 weeks, and that's a stretch. I like 2 or 3 days. I think 3 days of the Condor is the perfect thriller.
I agree
Yeah,
with
I think torque. I think thrillers have to have emotional torque, as well as a lot of story. It's got to be suspenseful. It's got to be surprising. So I think one of the things that's so cool that's reflected in the title of this panel, genre-bending something. Genre-bending novels.
Genre-bending.
Is that we're seeing so many novels that are one thing and another and another. We're blending genres, and so Monument 14 to me, well, certainly it has a thrilling plot that lays out in a super suspenseful way. It's a post-apocalyptic book. It's a young adult novel. You know, I don't think books are fitting quite so neatly into one category anymore, which is cool.
I don't really write in genre. I didn't really think I was writing a thriller. I sat down, I had this vision for a world, and I had these characters, and then what happened was that it was exciting, and then, it's gotten all kinds of different labels. It's been called dystopia, but that's a bad word now. So it's been called cyberpunk, which I thought was really cool, because I grew up reading that stuff, and I was like, oh, that's what I want to call it. So it's a cyberpunk novel. I decided yesterday when someone told me that. And I guess it's a thriller, maybe. I don't know if it fits the definition. What made it a thriller to me is I don't write with an outline, so I had no plan when I sat down to write it. I just started writing, and when I figured if I don't know what's happening next, but I want to find out, the reader will want to know what's happening next and want to find out. So that's how I wrote it, and I guess it was thrilling and nauseating as the writing process. So that's my definition of a thriller. Nauseating and thrilling.
Nauseating, thrilling, and I love that, because I didn't know that I was writing, I was just talking about this with somebody. I didn't know I was writing suburban noir, and I've been doing it for 20 years now. I've written almost 80 books until Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl came out. I was reading an article on the train a few weeks ago, and I realized that's what I'm writing. I thought it was domestic psychological suspense. So the labels changed. It's been around. They're like new genre. Around.
There's a gay character in the book, and because of that, I've been on a lot of gay YA lists, which is funny for a action thriller cyberpunk thing. It doesn't fit the normal boy meets boy, two boys kissing, Dante, those books. There's exploding robots, which is not typical for a gay novel.
I think it's a trend. We're going to see more of.
I'm going to do that. That's my next book. Actually, I can't believe that you just...
I think one of the other differences between thrillers and mysteries per se is that mysteries generally mysteries generally center upon a crime that needs to be solved, whereas thrillers don't necessarily have to have that element to them. Thrillers are much more about, to me, thrillers are much more about emotion and sort of kinetic, perpetual motion as opposed to solving something. You don't necessarily have to have that. I mean, there are a lot of times a somewhat, that element in a thriller, but that's not the main motor engine of what's going on, whereas in a mystery per se, that's what it is. It's generally like one person or a group of people trying to solve a crime. That to me is the main difference between the two of them.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think generally also genres are now they're more about mood than they are about any specificity to what the story is. A thriller is the mood that you're getting, that you're trying to evoke for the reader and the read. Action movies, it's the same thing. Horror movies. Now underneath those are all these subgenres that all get thrown in together, but it's all the genre itself is really for me to describe what type of emotion I want the viewer or the reader to get out of the experience. So the thriller, I want them to be excited.
I'm watching Alison.
I know Alison. That's three-man mic.
Yeah, that's exactly basically what I was going to say. Thrillers thrill. That's all they have to do. You have to be on the edge of your seat, and you have to be thrilled. And when I was growing up, I thought thrillers were the type of book my dad loved, which were like the Bourne Identity stuff, which is great. I love that stuff. Can't write it. Love to read it. But it really has expanded so much since then. It doesn't have to be a terrorist action that's going to blow up the entire world. It could be something, as Wendy was saying, that could blow up a family. That's somebody's entire world. Anything where someone's entire life depends on it, and so I think that's just important. It's that emotional aspect. I mean, mysteries tend to be maybe a little more cerebral, But there could also be a whodunit element to a thriller too, where you have to find out who done it, or else the world explodes.
But I like that. It's the ticking clock.
Yeah, the ticking clock I think is essential. How about Robin? Do you have anything to add there?
No, I found that all very erudite. I liked the definition of thriller as one thrilling yourself at the prospect of never finishing the book, which is how it usually works for me. But I don't know, I've been sort of sitting here musing over that because I almost always know what's going to happen at the end, and I do always wonder how you generate suspense and keep the mystery and the urgency going with the reader when you know what's going to happen and you know who's going to die and you know how you're going to get to the end. I mean, for me, the real challenge of writing a thriller or a mystery or a horror novel or anything like that is trying to evoke the emotion in the reader that you are not actually feeling yourself because you know how it's going to be okay in the end.
Yeah.
Hang on, we're passing Alison's book and my book. Thanks, guys. Okay, so to that end, all right, well, there.
It's like a jingle.
And I'm like this with coffee today too. Like, okay, so some of you, like, to that end, what Robin just said about knowing where you're going with that, some of you have written continuing characters. I don't know if all of you have. I know you guys, this is your first novel. Is this the first in, are we going to continue?
We've been talking about spinning off two of the characters. I just finished writing a sequel to a movie, so I've like my hat is off to people who find ways of bringing these characters back and back for more and more adventures. And luckily with Weaponized, we kept a lot of them alive, which I didn't do with my last movie.
No spoilers.
So we've definitely been talking about it. If he's up for it, I'm up for it. People want it.
People get really upset when you kill characters.
Oh yeah.
It's interesting.
Oh, yeah.
Like, I still get hate mail from books that I wrote 5 years ago. I mean, really angry letters that were written at like 2 in the morning that were just threatening to come after me and my children. I mean, it's amazing how upset people get.
It's better than though getting the why didn't you kill that person? Because that person was alive.
I got hate mail about someone that didn't end well in Proxy this morning from one of these panelists.
You shall remain nameless. I just really liked him. Sorry.
What is the social networking tool that they're using to write you hate mail?
Twitter and Tumblr mostly.
Okay, I'm not on Tumblr, so that's good. Okay.
And like letters cut out from magazines, put in slipping under the door.
Yeah, it's only really alarming when it shows up at your house.
I'd love to get one of those just because someone really worked hard.
Yeah.
They really wanted it.
Has everyone gotten hate mail? Is anybody waiting for the first hate mail?
I've gotten some hate, not like emails, but like, and not really directed to me, I think directed to like stuff I've done. So I guess to me.
We're related to you.
Take care of something right now.
Indirectly, but directly.
Yeah, I'm not going to say it because they could be here.
I know, in costume, which is really scary. So if you have continuing characters, because I've done it both ways. I've done series where I know exactly where I'm going. I know I can do it in 3 books, and I have the entire arc in mind. And others that I sort of take it book by book, and I go until I think it's done. So how do you guys write when you have a continuing character? Do you have a specific arc in mind? Is it a trilogy, or is it just endlessly spinning on?
I did have a continuing story that it's ending up to be a trilogy, but the character will probably continue after that, which sort of took place over 3 books, and that's hard, you know. I didn't know how hard that was when I thought I would do it. I thought, oh, it'll be great. I'll just continue this on forever, and it'll be like the One-Armed Man and the Fugitive. It'll just be forever and ever. But then it's like you get bored with it. You want to solve it. People. That's what I don't necessarily know if it's hate mail, but it's like, are we ever going to find out what happened to her sister ever? Like, okay, yeah. I think it's about time
It's funny because I think I used to think that. I used to write series, and I used to think that, and I used to whine and complain and bitch and just want to be done with them. But now I'm like, oh my God, writing the series, keeping the same characters, that would be like the easiest thing in the world. Why am I making myself come up with new characters in each book? This is crazy. And like a new plot and everything. Why would I do that? But no, it's funny, for me, the hard part was always walking away from the characters when I was done with the series. Like, I would get tired of the plot, and I would get tired of the world by the time I got to the end, but I've never been, I love the characters in this book, I love the characters in all my books, but I've never been as attached to characters as I was to the characters I wrote in like a 7-book series, when I just lived with them for years and years on end, and they became these real people to me. That series ended with graduation, and it was this very sort of cathartic moment for me where I felt like I was sending all these children off to college. And,
not paying for it.
But yeah, whereas with a single title, it's like I have this. It almost makes me sad not to write a sequel, just because even though I feel like their story has ended here, it's like when you go out to dinner with somebody. It's like when you have a first date and it's really awesome, and then they don't call you again, and you have imagined this whole future with them, but then they just disappear from your life. Not that ever happens to me. That's sort of how I feel right now.
I fall in love with these characters. I mean, I spend more time with them than I do my own flesh and blood relatives and people that I know in real life, but I do so many horrible things to them throughout the course of these stories that I feel like they've earned their rest by the end, and I'm ready to give them a break. And Proxy, I didn't plan a sequel for. It ends when it's done, and I'm like, okay, Sid, Knox have suffered enough. Give them their peace. And then my publisher came to me and actually said, we want a sequel, and we want it in 6 months, I think I had. I thought, I don't know, did you read the ending? Like, I don't know how I'm gonna do that. And so I had to actually, out of the ether, conjure, kind of invent new characters for some of them, and come up with a whole new story that, again, I had not planned. That's a theme of me, I guess. I don't plan things. I also, when I got here, didn't know where I was going. I'm just not a planner. But yeah, I'm sort of ready to let them. They still live in my head, but then it's almost like I get them back when I stop writing about them. Because when I write about them, they belong to the readers. When I don't write about them, they're just mine.
Do you have,
I have 14 kids in my books, and they're in terrible, horrible danger. So I had the very same feelings of loving these kids and wanting them to be safe, and then torturing them. The things I do to these poor kids is really unforgivable. Here I am!
Torture imaginary children.
Yeah. So what I was really surprised by was because I'm writing a book a year, and then I hand a book in, and then I publicize the one coming out, and then I go on tour, and I have the summer, and then I get back to work, right? So in that summer vacation for my kids was that they would grow, just like real kids. In the gap between writing book 2 and book 3, when I started to write book 3, I realized that one of these characters was just furious. She was so angry, and I'd never written in her voice before, and suddenly she's narrating, and she just was beautifully, like she had grown. She's a 16-year-old girl, and she turned into an adult over the summer. And that was a real surprise to me. I'm just realizing I'm laughing because I didn't answer the question at all.
You're talking about the voices in your head. And
Let me tell you some poetry.
Isn't this a supernatural panel?
Mind-bending visions. How about Nick and David? If you guys continue, do you have something in mind? Like, are you just sort of winging it from here on in with Weaponized? If you go forward.
It's interesting. When I listen to you guys talk about living with the same people, the one of the characters who we actually would probably want to continue with is the villain. And so it's interesting to me because it sounds like you guys get really attached to your protagonists and you fall in love with them, and I actually really fell in love with my villain. And the rest of them, although I like them very much, I don't think they have a lot of life left in them. I think you can keep going for a while.
I'm not sure what that says about you.
I don't know.
I'm very sure what that says about you. It's nothing.
I love that idea. I mean, to me, a lot of times the most fascinating character, and you really rarely see that. I love that idea. Do it.
It's interesting. It sounds like in a lot of the cases of, not all of you, but in a lot of you, the villain tends to be something not personified necessarily.
The world. Right.
Yeah, exactly. It seems to be either a toxic event or in your case there's no government. Whereas it seems like it's hard to write. I would imagine it would be nigh to impossible to write a sort of continuing series with a very strong villain because your villains are mostly environmental. Whereas we sort of
like Ripley was one of the people we talked about.
Yeah,
a lot,
exactly.
and Hannibal Lecter as well, just someone that you can make your villain be either the main character in the sequel again or the person that the new protagonist will be going after. There's a lot of different ways to play.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point. Do you guys on this side of the table think that's like a thing in young adult fiction, that the villain is more often it's a structure than a person?
There always has to be some sort of representative of it, right? I mean, it's not, even if it's a larger system that's at fault, there always has to be a face to put on that system. Like, there's always someone who characterizes
But I feel like if you imagine, can you all hear me if I talk without leaning?
I don't know. Can you hear without the mics, guys, or do you need the?
I'll talk about
okay.
I'll go counsel.
Yeah. Might need the mics.
Because I feel like a villain is someone who, if you told the story from their point of view, they would be the hero.
Well, that's it, yeah. The villain's always...
So you create a structure wherein people can act villainously, but I kind of don't think I write villains. I write people who make different choices, and some of them are not nice. So I don't know, but that's interesting, because
Is there room for ambiguity? Because if we wrote like a really pretty
Well, he would have to be an anti-hero.
Exactly.
But I think again it would have to be more of a Lecter situation where he might not necessarily be the protagonist, he'd just be the recurring character, and someone else would have to be going after him, or you have to set it up where your villain is going after someone who's even worse than they are.
Yeah,
in
so
order
like
for you
kind
to
of
get
a
behind
Dexter
them.
sort of
Exactly, in order for you to be
Yeah.
able to get behind them
do the Richard
emotionally.
Stark, Parker.
Yeah.
Did you guys, in terms of like young adult fiction, do you guys ever feel? This is why I personally don't write young adult fiction. But like, would you feel hamstrung at all by like the fact that you can't? Or maybe you can, and I'm wrong, but do you feel like you're ever not able to explore something either content-wise or like ambiguity-wise?
I'll take this one. I've done both. So I do adult...
Can you repeat the question to Michelle?
I go both ways.
Yeah.
No,
Water pants.
Exactly, I know. It's called 50 Shades of Don't Turn Around. I get asked that question a lot because I started out writing adult thrillers, and I still do adult novels and I do young adult.
Yeah.
And I mean, the only difference to me is the protagonists are younger. I do go through and do a little find search at the end, and I try and tone the language down a little because I tend to be a bit of a potty mouth. And that's not necessarily a no-no in YA, but I feel like it reads a little more strongly on the page than it does when you hear it.
right.
I don't really write, jokes aside, I don't have tons of sexual situations in either the young adult or the young adult, just because I feel like these people are on the run. I mean, nothing drives me crazier than a book where there are two people who are being pursued and they're, it's chasing, and then stop. Oh, baby, I'm going oh, they're right behind us. Oh, how did they catch up? And they start running again. I mean, that makes me bonkers. teenagers. So, there's always some romance, but I don't find that there's a lot of time for that.
Yeah, I'm going to speak to this as well as this book that I have written keeps being referred to when I go do bookstore events and stuff as like, oh my God, the darkest and bloodiest book I have ever read. Don't get too close. I like a lot of the stuff that I have written for young adults has been dark or edgy or filled with, what we would call content or whatever. I mean, my first series is called The 7 Deadly Sins. And so the first novel that I ever wrote is titled Lust, which made my mother really excited to like hang the book cover on her door at work and show our rabbi. But this, so this book, you picture sort of Stephen King levels of people getting slaughtered in a variety of gruesome and well-described ways, and so it's very violent, and it's very, it's about people giving into their darkest desires, and I wanted to write the truth of that. So, like, the darkness that people go to is really extreme, and I mean, it's not really ambiguous that it's dark, but it's good people doing bad things that may or may not be under their control. Like, I'd like to think there's a level of moral ambiguity there, but there is definitely it's definitely rated R in a way that I think people outside of young adult don't necessarily know is acceptable in young adult. And it's funny, when I gave it to my editor, I was curious what she was going to say and whether there would be any pushback on the content or the language or anything like that. And actually the only thing that there was any pushback on was the fact that I had so many scenes with adult characters. Which is funny because I always go around saying, I think all of us as young adult authors give lip service to this idea of like, young adult is anything about teenagers, and the only thing, you can do anything in young adult except write a novel about adults. And I think it sort of turned out to be right. Like, there's one scene that I had to take out of here, and not because it was more graphic than the other scenes, but because it was about like somebody walking in to find his wife like in bed with the gym teacher and taking out a chainsaw and whatever. But it wasn't the chainsaw that was the problem. It was the adults. It turns out. I think the short answer there is no, and you should write a young adult book because you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, I've got some chainsaws in my books as well. What's interesting is, just thinking about your question, is when I wrote Monument 14, I really had teenagers in mind to read it. I didn't think that kids below the age of 13 would read it. And then when I was doing the first signings, moms would come up with their 10 and 11-year-olds and give me the book to sign, and I'd be like, what? You can't read this yet. It's too, there's like sex in here, there's things, It made me very uncomfortable. But I think what happens with kids reading up anyway is that their minds throw a veil, I think, over to content that's too heavy for them. I remember being about 11 or 12 and reading The Color Purple. And then my mom finding out that I'd read it, being like, honey, I think we should sit down and talk about The Color Purple and what you've just read. And I was like, oh, I don't really get it, So I think that anyway, that when you're writing YA, if you go too far, your editor will certainly tell you, pull you back. But I also think that the audience sort of self-selects. If it's too heavy, they stay away, and maybe even they even read it and don't quite know what they've read.
There's also a great Maurice Sendak said. He said when he was a child, he knew terrible things. He just couldn't let adults know that he knew them because it would scare them too much. And he also said that the reality of childhood, and I love this line, the reality of childhood is not sweetness and light, it's psychopaths and cannibals vomiting in your mouth. That's Maurice Sendak, picture book author. So to me, it's like, I think you don't have to pull your punches at all.
Actually, I think in some ways, adult audiences are probably a little more prudish than the teenagers, especially where some of the swearing is concerned. I mean, that's the thing that sometimes you get hate mail about. Like, you could have somebody brutally hacking someone to death, but God forbid you drop an F-bomb in that scene.
And part of that, I think, comes
from teenagers. I don't think
from the empathy. Teenagers tend to be a little more self-focused, and it's not happening to them on the page. Whereas adults, especially parents, parents get really upset at some of the violence against other kids in this book, whereas teenagers don't. And and I'm not sure why that is.
Do you think that, like, for example, like I was born in '78, and I wonder now a lot, like, do you think that some of the things that we were reading, you know, at that, when I was reading at sort of 12, 13, would just due to sort of the literary schematics of the moment, would they actually come out as YA now, as opposed to being sort of main, sort of like, for example, like I think about something like Stephen King's Firestarter, for example. Like, if that were to come out today, would that be YA, or would that actually still fall under the mainstream fiction?
Okay. Well,
exactly.
I'm
Yeah.
leaping upon the microphone here because
okay.
I too was born in '78 and
nice.
obsessively read Stephen King and also Flowers in the Attic and a whole variety of other things that were probably not like appropriate for people of that age. So I think that is a really great question, and I think personally, I think in the case of Stephen King, none of his books would be published as YA no matter what, because I think my understanding is Stephen King has like a real very specific feeling that his books should not be labeled that way, because it's kind of stupid to label a book as for any particular age. Like, he's not an idiot. He knows teenagers are reading his books, and I think his feeling is it would be redundant to label this as a book for teenage. Like, he has enough power that he could decide that for himself. But yeah, it is. There was no YA the way we know it when we were teenagers. Like, YA was Sweet Valley High when we were teenagers, and maybe the Babysitters Club if you were a little slow.
I was about to raise my hand.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean, like, if you discovered the Babysitters Club at 16, you would technically be a little slow. My closest friend was not allowed to read Sweet Valley High because it was too skanky. She only read the Babysitters Club, so I have like a real hierarchy in my
I used to write to my sisters because that was the only way I could read boys kissing. Like kissing boys, I could imagine myself as the girl.
Boys kissing girls.
That sounds like a lot of work.
But yeah,
I think it goes the other way now, though. I actually think that they're labeling books that are really just literary novels as YA because it's easier to sell YA right now. Like, I look at The Book Thief, which I had no idea was supposed to be a young adult novel, or Codename Verity, which was, really unsettling. I mean, it starts off with, this captured prisoner being tortured by Nazis, and it's very graphic and really intense, and it's written in diary form, so you're kind of right in it. Speaking of what they allow in YA, and I think 10 years ago that would have just come out as a mainstream literary novel. But I think it's easier to sell YA right now, and so I think it's actually gone in the other direction.
But yeah, it means that people who are not in the young adult field are often taken aback to discover what is published now as YA, because in their head, it's not as bad as 10 years ago when you would introduce yourself as a YA author and people would ask if you drew the pictures to go along with the text. But I think people, understandably, because why would they know, don't realize the breadth of the genre that exists now.
I want to see the illustrated version of The Waking Dark.
I have to say, because I'm older than you guys, so sadly. But I was born in the 60s, and YA in the 70s was really edgy and gritty, and there was stuff out there then that would never be published. I started writing in YA. I sold my first book in '93, and then the market just died, and I started writing adult stuff. And then it came back. I went back to it in 2003, and it had changed drastically in those years. But it was grittier and it was edgier, and then it changed over to Sweet Valley High. So I'm old enough, sadly, I think I'm the only one here to remember those edgy, gritty days. Allison, you and I, we toured together. We know how old we are.
I started my writing for kids started as much younger. It was middle grade, so like 8 to 12-year-olds. And there's a lot that I can't do, and I sort of have to pull back from some of the darker, at least more explicit violence and sex and that kind of stuff just isn't there. So for me, YA felt so liberating. I was like, they can curse, they can be horny teenagers, all this stuff I can do, which I can't do in a book called We Give a Squid a Wedgie,
Do you think the end of YA do you think the grittiness of YA in the 70s and then the transfer over to sort of non-edgy YA in the 80s had anything to do with Reagan?
It was a different culture, right? I feel like
there was nothing. I mean, for me, that was the 80s, and there was Flowers in the Attic forever,
Yes,
Sweet Valley High, and nothing else.
Weren't there also all those problem novels in the 80s where two people would have sex and then one would get pregnant and then die of a miscarriage?
Oh, yeah,
Or two people would have sex and then get into a car accident and then die. There was a lot of death and sex books
You know, like, if you have fun, you die.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of like the marijuana would kill you. But
Yeah, it was the age of the after-school special.
Which is
I
still
remember
the
there were
case,
those
it sounds
books.
like in most of our books, but now they're no longer dying because of their problem behavior. They're dying because the world has just ended.
Right, they die, there's death, and then there's sex.
I will say though, no matter, I think you guys went pretty far in all of your books, but I will say I think we have you.
Yeah, tell us about guys, because this is really interesting. Can I say that you were college roommates?
Yeah.
And now they're writing together, and I've collaborated over the years, and I've used different sort of methods to collaborate. I'm wondering how you guys, like, are you always in agreement? Do you flip chapters back and forth? How do you write together?
Right with a sock on the door.
Stoic sucks is happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I can start, sure, absolutely. Well, you know, David has always been the first person who's read anything I've done anyway, so in a strange way it was just sort of a more active continuation on that kind of relationship. So, you know, basically when we decided to do this, it was mostly we sat there and did what we normally do, which is, you know, actually the only difference is we both came in earlier in the process than we normally do. Like, for example, David is probably the best sort of like story breaker and sort of structuralist that I know. And so, you know, his input was incredibly important in sort of the planning stage. So I would say actually that in the beginning when we were just sort of, because we do outline. And we had a really, really specific outline. And then, you know, once we,
Well, I think just generally, I think for collaborators, it's really important to know the other's voice. And I think I know Nick's voice extremely well, and he knows mine, just having known each other for so many years, almost 20 years now. I'm saying for almost 20 years we've known each other, so we know each other's voices. We've read each other's scripts, we've read each other's short stories, each other's essays. We've, you know, exchanged papers to make sure, you know, to check the others and to help each other out. So by the time we were ready to finally officially write a book, it was like, okay, we've done this before, now let's do it for real.
Are your voices different?
It's you know, they're different, but we love the same things, and that's the key. I mean, we definitely also have our strengths and our weaknesses, and you have to almost confront it like a marriage. Like, we're going to go in there, we're going to be partners, and we're going to listen to each other's, and we'll be able to debate and to argue, and to, if someone feels really strongly about a story idea or a character idea, and you have to say, okay, I trust you, go with it, and I'll read it later and say, you're right, it totally works, or you suck, and you should listen to me. It was usually you were right, because Nick's really, really on point with a lot of things, and he knows the genre extremely well. So in terms of just specifically how we tackled Weaponized, it was, yeah, we sat down at the beginning, we wrote the story together, and we figured out who all the characters were going to be and what the world, and we knew what the tone was going to be, because that was really, really important for what the vibe of the book was going to be. We wanted to be a modern Hitchcock story. We wanted it to feel really, really moody and gritty, and also, though, move at the speed of a Bourne movie. It's got to move, like you said, The 3 Days of the Condor being one of my favorite movies of all time. And funny enough, the book was 6 days with the Condor, and the first note was make it 3 days. so it was like that. Let's just make it, so make sure we keep it on track. And for me, I need to know what the spine of a book is before I can do anything. The spine of a movie, the spine of a book, whatever. So once we had that in set, Nick set off, and he started putting it all together, and then he would send it to me, you know, every couple of chapters, and I'd give my notes and go back to him, and he'd fill out the entire world in ways that I couldn't possibly do, because my background is screenwriting, his background is prose.
The one thing I really wanted to, I don't know if I'm loud enough or not. I think I might be. I know. The one thing I really wanted to do, and this was something we agreed on really early on, was we really wanted to do a very like grungy, third worldy thriller, because like particularly in the thriller genre today, like so many of them take place in really in like Europe still, or the middle, or the Middle East, and like we really wanted to get away, because to be perfectly honest, most of the really crazy espionage-driven stuff is actually going on in corners of the world that no one really talks about, and so that's why it takes place in Cambodia, it takes place there's some in Africa, and you know, we really wanted to just like take it into, like we really wanted to do like, okay, this is going to be a really dark third world, like nasty kind of piece of work, because it's just so much spy fiction to me today seems just incredibly that I just feel like they still don't think the Cold War ended in terms of like settings. Yeah, in terms of settings primarily. Yeah.
Yeah, what about everybody else's setting? Like, tell us about your settings and your research for your settings.
Well, my last book actually did take place in Prague. But there are no spies.
Okay,
That's fine. You got pass on that one.
Yeah, the Book of Blood and Shadow is a whole sort of historical, religious, fundamentalist, crazy, code-breaking mystery thriller in Prague, which was super fun. I went to go research it myself, and I just sort of wandered through Prague with like my little notebook, and I looked like I was a super lame, like existential, like, oh, I'm having a mystical experience in Prague and taking pictures of the cobblestones, but you know, I told myself to stop thinking about that because that's ridiculous. And yeah, it was kind of amazing, and it was the first time I had ever actually done any sort of on-site intense research for a book, and it was such it almost supplied its own spine for the book, because it was like I had this real world that I had to work against. The previous thing I'd written had been a dystopia, and it was such like a glorious pleasure to be able to just say, okay, well, they have to go that way because that's the street you would take to get there, and here's the stuff that's on the street, and here's some, like the pivotal scene is set in this church that is built entirely out of bones of plague victims, which is a thing I didn't even know existed until I went to Prague and saw it, and it sort of opened up the entire second half of the book for me. And then, you know, under the theory of always write your books now about places you want to go and visit, this book is set in rural Kansas.
And where? Kansas.
Rural Kansas. So I downshift.
Before I wrote for kids at all, I was a journalist, and I worked primarily in refugee camps and with refugees who were in urban settings around the world, in Africa and in Asia. So I spent a lot of times in like the Kibera slum outside Nairobi, and in the slums of Bangkok and Rangoon and all these places. So I had a lot of that sort of world in my head, and I'd written about it as a journalist, but to create the world of Proxy, at least where the Proxies live, where all the orphans and stuff live, I just pulled right out of that experience. So in a way, I was writing about Burma, and I was writing about Kenya. Without writing, I just called it. It actually takes place in what used to be Denver. And then the place where the rich people live was a little bit Dubai, just because it's just so excessive, a little bit Vegas, and a little bit how I grew up. So I took these real places, and then I fictionalized them, and I grew up in Dubai. No, just with I grew up fairly privileged, and so I wanted to problematize some of my privilege in my prep school upbringing by throwing it into a dystopia and making fun of all my classmates. Just murdering scores of them. It was great.
What's very interesting is in China, Proxy, your book is not that far off, because they actually do similar things like that, where like, and it doesn't necessarily happen with like the children of privilege, but just if you got the money, if you have the money, you can actually pay someone to do your time for you.
Yeah.
So
it's not that far off from the justice system in America.
What was interesting with the Monument 14 series was Monument 14 was my debut, so it was the first novel that I'd written. And in a way, I made it easy on myself because I locked the kids in a superstore. I didn't have to do a lot of research, right? Because I know what a superstore is like. I went to Target and mapped it out many times. I was told I'm not allowed to take pictures. I don't know why. But then in book 2, the kids leave. Some of the kids leave the store. And then I had created all these problems in the first book that I had to then juggle in the second book. And then by the third book, I had some of the kids, I don't want to spoil anything, but some of them make it to a refugee camp, some of them. That makes it not a spoiler. And now I created this terrible calamity with an earthquake, a mega tsunami, this chemical weapons spill, and I blithely just made it all. I just created it all in the first book because I had them in a superstore. And then by the time I got to the third book, they were out in this world that I had created and destroyed, and I had all of these huge problems that I had to juggle. For example, in book 1, there's a radio broadcast that the kids overhear that says, a zone in a 500-mile radius of the Four Corners area has to be evacuated. And then I went back when I was writing the third book, and I was like, all right, well, how much of the country has been evacuated? A 1,000-mile circle in the middle of the country had to be evacuated. This was a lot to work around. Problems. That's about the setting of my books.
You know, it's funny because I actually thought of your book. I was just in Denver, and there's a scene in the second book that takes place, you know, by the Denver airport. I hope that's not giving away too much, but I don't know if anyone's been to the Denver airport, but as you're approaching it, there is this giant blue, anatomically correct horse with glowing orange eyes. I mean, we were driving up to that at like dawn on this book tour, and you're all bleary, and you're tired, and you're approaching this thing that just looms out of the darkness, and I immediately thought of Emmy's book, because I was like, that's freaking me out, man. Whose idea was this?
The artist was killed during the installation.
Yes, the artist died during the installation. That's how freaky that thing is. It's a demon horse. So I feel really boring because I said the first book kicks off in Boston. And it's our Boston, basically. I mean, the only thing that I changed was I created a disease that only affects teenagers. But aside from that, it's Boston. I mean, and I know Boston. I go on Google Maps. Everything is, you know, just as it is. Although I sometimes get nasty emails from people who mistakenly try and correct me about things in Boston. Like, no, I double checked that. It's a Charlie card now. But yeah, I mean, and then I expanded out in the other books. But I've done both. I wrote a dystopian standalone. And I don't know, there's pros and cons to each. I mean, I feel like, you know, aside from giant, terrifying blue horses, which apparently occur in both worlds.
How about Alison? Terrifying blue horses and
Yeah, I mean, I have a giant, you know, monster made out of smog. No, I don't. Most of my books take place in New York City, actually, and they're present day and they're non-dystopian. So, but the thing is, it's funny when you're writing thrillers, when you're writing crime fiction. You have the most exacting readers in the world. You have to get every gun right. You have to get every setting right. And so a lot of times I'll take Westchester County, like in these books I have a couple of fictionalized towns in Westchester County because I'm sick and tired of people calling me up on, the library is not on Main Street in Tarrytown. So,
They actually know.
it's like everything has to be so, I mean, I can't understand how people can like write completely false biographies and that gets past everyone. And yet, damn, if you put a cop in a wool uniform in the summer, you will just hear about it.
or get the weapon wrong.
Yeah, or get the wrong kind of gun, you know. Yeah, exactly. He'd never be able to hold up a Glock 45 and it's okay. So, so I know New York City very well, so I set a lot of my books there. I have one book that I set in Los Angeles that's a thriller about a tabloid reporter, and I was a tabloid reporter in Los Angeles, so that was fun. And then I have a book set in a fictional town in Mexico based on a town that I used to live in Mexico, and I wanted to write a sort of, a kind of a Rosemary's Baby type thing, and this town sort of spoke to me in that very, beautiful but darkly sinister kind of way. And so I set it in a town based on that town. There were no strange cults in the town that I lived in Mexico. So yeah, I basically used places that I've been. So
David is in charge of gun accuracy. That's one of his many jobs in our collaboration.
That made me sound really badass. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, I think we have time for just a couple of questions, probably. Does anyone have? Go ahead. Yeah.
All right. It seems like all y'all kind of traveled a lot. Would you recommend doing that for people who want to be authors, go out, experience all the stuff you guys did? Like you said, you went to like Africa or something like that.
I'd recommend travel for anyone who wants to be anything or do anything.
Although, I mean, speaking as somebody who spent most of my life watching TV and reading in my house, I would say that there are many of us who become writers because we prefer to do that rather than have adventures in the real world. I definitely don't feel that it is necessary to go out and do anything exciting or risky or interesting if you have a good enough imagination.
Yeah, and you don't have to. I mean, it certainly helps to get a feel for a place, but the joy and beauty of the internet is that there's ways to do that now. I mean, I set a book in Mexico City, and at the time I was pregnant, and there was no way that I was going to Mexico City, 8 months along, and so I just used other sources. I spent a lot of time talking to people who lived there. I spent a lot of time on maps. I read travel books. You know, I mean, I'm not saying it's ideal, but, you know, yeah, it would be fabulous if I could just get on an airplane and go research all these places. You know, I love, like, Jim Rollins has this, like, whole blog where he's like, as I'm in Egypt researching my next book. It's like, yeah, that would be nice. It's really not the reality for most authors, exactly. Like, most of us can't afford to do that, either, you know, time-wise or financially, so do it if you can, but if not, don't let that stop you.
Other questions? Yeah?
What do you guys do when you end up getting stuck? Because sometimes I'm sure you guys end up getting to a point in the book where you know what's going to happen, you're so excited to read it, to get to that part, and then it jumps to a completely different scene and you're going, oh crap, there's a space to fill in the middle. What do you guys do for something like that?
You know, I think that writers
I was thinking it, wasn't going to say.
David and I actually have this rule, which is write the bad version, which is just like you can go back and fix it. The most important thing is to just get it down so you have something to work with. Because that way you won't get blocked. You'll have more work to do at the end of the day because it's going to be really shitty.
Hopefully it'll get you to a better place. That'll get you to the good place, the place that you want to get to. But
You know,
just have
that's-
to go back and fix it later, which is better than having nothing there.
That's the approach. That's absolutely right, and that's what I was going to say. Is that I think writer's block is your internal critic acting up at the moment you're trying to write, right? So you can't have those two hats on at the same time. You're either being the creator or you're being the critic. And when you start criticizing your work, it's like throwing a rock in the mechanics. It messes you all up. And so if you do that, if you write the crappy version, you're saying to the critic, like, hey, you know what? Give me a little room. Just sit over there. Stop being over my shoulder. Let me just do a bad version, and then we'll make it good later.
I've noticed, I've been writing fiction full-time for about 6 years, and I've noticed in that time, because you have to kill your inner critic in order to produce and to keep writing through the times where you think you suck and through the times where you feel like you're blocked, I've noticed it's actually changed how I talk too, where I'm like, the filter is gone and stuff just flies out.
I know.
I can offer a practical tip to that as well that I figured out last year and has changed my writing life, which is if you're doing a thing where you're writing every day or every certain amount of time, which you should all be doing if you want to be a writer, if you end the day of writing by figuring out what you're going to start writing the next day, it makes everything easier. Because it's like when I hit that point where I can't write anything anymore and all I want to do is just go have a cookie and take a nap, I cheat by sort of just writing like 2 paragraphs of like, okay, here's what's going to happen next and blah, blah, blah. And it doesn't really count as writing because it's basically just like me spilling onto the page for a page. But then in the morning, I don't even have to think, like I don't have to come up with it, I don't have to imagine anything first thing in the morning because I don't even drink coffee, so it would be a disaster. I can just go to those 2 paragraphs I wrote the day before, and it's like you fool yourself into managing to write a whole novel that way.
I don't agree with the that you have to write every day thing. I have to say, like, I feel like that's something that also stops a lot of people, and, you know, again, like, it's great if you can. Like Stephen King's got this whole thing where he's like, he writes 4 hours a day, he reads 4 hours a day. He also had a wife who raises children. So, you know, I mean, what I would give for a wife. Like, if I had someone to handle all the minutia and I could just sit in a room and read and write all day, that would be heaven, right? But, you know, I don't have that. So there are weeks when I don't get much work done because, you know, the water heater broke and I've got to go hustle kids to and from school. I mean, I've got a life outside of being a writer. So I feel like it's a lot of pressure. The truth is, if you write a page a day, at the end of the year, you have a book. And if you write 5 pages in one day and nothing for 4 days, you get the same result. So it's whatever you can do, whenever you can do it.
You have your hand up there, and then Purple, you're the last question. So these two, because we're running out of time. Go ahead, yeah.
What is breaking the story?
Breaking the story, it's basically figuring out the beats in between the main sequences that are going to get you from place to place. So it's like, you know, let's say you have a character who you need to get 2 characters together at one place. Breaking the story is just basically figuring out, like, all right, what are the story beats that are going to allow us to get them to that place. So that's pretty much it.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's like blueprint for your story.
Yeah.
Yep. Go ahead.
How do you develop your characters from
that's a craft question, and it really is about sharpening your craft as a writer. I like to use acting exercises to help me sharpen my characters. So I go, one thing I'll do is I'll eavesdrop in a coffee shop, and I just write down snippets of what people are saying, because it helps you capture the cadence of their voice. I mean, really write down what they're saying. Put in the you-knows and the ums and all that. And another thing I really like to do is I go to the mall and I follow teenagers around. You're not creepy. I know, it's so creepy. But I walk, it's even worse, because what I do is I stay behind them about 20 feet and I walk like them. I walk like the teenagers.
Yeah,
And
the bestseller list is not the only list she's on.
There's guys walking like this, and you walk like this, and you're like, all right, I own the fucking world. And there's teenage girls who walk like this, and you walk like this, and you get sad a little, you get drawn in. So there are two of my crazy techniques for
Everyone's gonna run from you when we leave this room.
I think also,
Malls nationwide.
I think when you come up with characters in the first place, I mean, at least with me, I'm first inspired by characters, and I think about these people, and I see them in my head, and I get so excited about them that I think, I've never really experienced that specific problem. I had a lot of other problems, but as far as keeping my characters distinct, you've heard everybody here talking, basically like crazy people going, I don't want to leave them, I miss them, I love them so much, but it's true, you become attached to your characters, and so I think, for me anyway, I think a lot of it is just intuitive, you want to write these characters very badly, and so you write them.
All right, I'm going to give you guys a tip that's actually way less interesting than either of those, which is just that you can't have everybody want the same thing. Like if each and every one of your characters wants something different, they automatically will sound different. So like if 4 people are going after one thing, just have each and every one of them going after it for a different reason, and you won't fall into that problem.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice. And you have to know what every character on the page wants. Is the addendum to that. I struggle a lot with trying to make my characters separate. This book has like 20 characters in it, so it was like a war. But for me, I try to give them backstory is maybe the wrong word, but I mean, I actually figure out what their families are like, which is weird because in YA, the family rarely appears that much on the page. And so I sort of know the family backstory for all these characters that never actually appears in the book, but for some reason I've latched onto that as like the thing that kind of forges their personality. And in the process of figuring it out, I always end up answering questions about the characters that I wouldn't have thought to ask otherwise, and then I can sort of let them loose because they somehow have a life of their own after that.
Okay, I think it's 5 o'clock. I think we have to sign. I think, are we all signing? We're all signing now at 5, so come on over, you get a book. Thank you so much for coming. And do you want to add something else? We'll be at, I don't know if we're all signing it. Are we in the same place? Table 21. Okay, so
We'll be at table 21.
Come find us.
Come on down.